The moment I walked through those glass doors, every head in the boardroom turned. I had rehearsed this walk 100 times in my mind. In parking lots. In the shower. On the drive from Halifax to Toronto, somewhere around the stretch of highway outside Truro where my hands started shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over and just breathe. I had told myself I was ready. I wasn't ready. But I walked in anyway. Let me take you back to when I was 19 years old, standing on the sidewalk outside my father's office building in downtown Toronto on a Wednesday afternoon in November, holding a garbage bag with everything I owned in it. My winter coat was inside that bag. I hadn't had time to put it on. It was -11. I remember thinking that the cold felt like a second punishment, like the weather itself was agreeing with him. My father hadn't thrown me out of a house. He'd thrown me out of a life. We weren't a regular family, even though we pretended to be. My father had built Whitmore Financial Services from a single office above a dry cleaner in Mississauga into a mid-sized wealth management firm with clients across Ontario and Alberta. He was the kind of man who had framed newspaper clippings of himself on the wall behind his desk. The kind of man who corrected people's pronunciation of his name at dinner parties and then laughed, like it was a joke, like your embarrassment was charming to him. I was his eldest daughter, his only daughter actually. I had one brother 5 years younger who had my father's eyes and my father's confidence, and who had never once been told that his ambitions were inconvenient. My name is Phoebe, and for 19 years I had done everything right. I got the grades. I took the right courses. I got into the University of Toronto's Rotman Commerce program, which my father announced at Christmas dinner that year like he had personally built the school. I smiled. I thanked him. I told him I was excited. What I didn't tell him was that I had already deferred my admission. I had been accepted 6 months earlier to a fine arts program at NSCAD in Halifax. Painting. The thing I had loved my entire life. The thing my father had called a hobby since I was 12 years old, in a tone that made it clear he meant something much harsher than that. I wasn't going to tell him. My plan was to go to Halifax, finish the program, figure out my life on my own terms, and call him when I had something concrete to show for it. My mother found my acceptance letter in my room. She didn't mean any harm. She never meant any harm. That was the thing about my mother. She was so thoroughly shaped by my father's world that she genuinely didn't understand that some information was not his to have. She handed him the letter at breakfast. I watched her do it. I watched the look on his face shift from curiosity to something I can only describe as controlled fury. He asked me to come to his office that afternoon. He laid the letter on his desk. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "You've embarrassed this family." I told him I hadn't done anything yet. I told him it was my life. He told me that as long as I was living under his name, eating at his table, using the cell phone he paid for and the health coverage his firm provided, my life was not entirely mine. I told him I would go to Halifax. He told me that if I did, I would go without his name, his money, or his goodwill. I asked him if he was serious. He picked up his desk phone and called his assistant and asked her to send someone up to help me pack my things. That was it. That was the whole conversation. 11 minutes, I found out later when I checked my call history. I had phoned my best friend right after, crying so hard she couldn't understand me. 11 minutes to dismantle a family relationship. I was 19 years old. I had $412 in my checking account. I had a garbage bag of clothes and a portfolio of paintings that I had been working on for 2 years. I had nowhere to go that night. I went to Halifax. I won't pretend it was brave. It was the only option that felt like it still had oxygen in it. The first year was the hardest. I deferred a semester to find work. I waitressed at a pub on Argyle Street. I cleaned vacation rentals on weekends. I ate a lot of grocery store sushi and instant ramen and tried not to do the math too often on what I had left in my account. I applied for every bursary NCCAD offered. I got 2 of them. I cried in the financial aid office, which I still think about sometimes when I want to feel appropriately humiliated. My mother called me twice in those first 3 months. Both times she asked me to come home. Both times I asked if he was willing to have a conversation. Both times she said she didn't want to be in the middle. She was always in the middle. That was her whole position. I stopped expecting her calls after a while, not because I didn't love her. I loved her in the complicated, grieving way you love someone who has chosen not to fight for you, but because hope is expensive when you're already broke. I finished the program. I was 23 when I graduated. I stayed in Halifax. I found a studio apartment near the waterfront that cost me $900 a month and smelled like old radiator and sea salt. I started selling work. Small pieces, local galleries, an Etsy shop that somehow took off because of a single Instagram post from someone who had 500,000 followers and had bought one of my prints on a whim. I built something, slowly, imperfectly, out of materials I had chosen myself. By the time I was 28, I had a small but real gallery clientele. I had a partner. I'll call him by his actual name because he matters. His name is Wesley. And he was a structural engineer who laughed at my terrible jokes and drove me to the emergency room when I broke my wrist and never once made me feel like what I did for a living was less serious than what he did. We lived together. We had a dog named after a Tom Waits album. We were happy in a quiet, daily way that I had not expected would feel like enough and turned out to feel like everything. My father and I did not speak for 9 years. I heard about him occasionally through my brother, who had joined the firm and who texted me on birthdays and at Christmas, and who occupied the careful, neutral position of someone who loved both sides of a wall without wanting to climb it. He wasn't cruel about it. He just didn't know what to do with us, and I couldn't blame him. Then, in early March, my brother called on a Tuesday evening. My mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's 2 years earlier. I knew that, my brother had told me, and I had sent her a card and felt wretched and inadequate for days afterward. She had declined faster than anyone expected. She had moved into a memory care facility in Oakville in January. She passed on a Tuesday. My brother told me gently. He cried. I cried. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing and everything. The way you talk when someone is gone and language suddenly feels like a currency that's lost its value. And then he said there's a family meeting. For the estate, Dad wants everyone there. I hadn't been everyone for 9 years. But I booked the flight. Wesley drove me to Stanfield. He offered to come with me and I said no, and then I stood in the departures line regretting it for 20 minutes before I texted him and said actually, yes please, if you can get a flight. He got a flight. He met me in Toronto the next day. I want to stop here and tell you something about Wesley, because the comments on the video that eventually came out of all of this kept asking about him, and I think people misunderstood. He wasn't there to rescue me. He was there because he is the kind of person who shows up. Not dramatically, not with a plan, just quietly, physically present, which is sometimes the most radical thing a person can do for you. He had taken 2 days off work. He had packed a bag in 40 minutes. He had not asked me once whether I was sure about this. The estate meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at my father's office. The firm had moved since I'd last been there. They were in a building on Bay Street now. The kind of building with the commissionaire at the front desk and a wall of frosted glass with the company name etched into it in a font that communicated well without saying so. We arrived early. I stood outside for 3 minutes. Wesley stood next to me. Neither of us spoke. I went in. My father was already seated at the head of the conference table when I walked in. He looked older. Of course he did. It had been 9 years, but the posture was the same. Shoulders back, hands flat on the table. The expression that said he was waiting and that your arrival had confirmed his patience was justified. My brother was there. He stood up and hugged me quickly, tightly, and I felt him exhale. My father's lawyer was there, a man I didn't recognize. And there was one other person at the table, a woman about my father's age, who was introduced to me as a family friend, in a tone that communicated she was considerably more than that. She did not introduce herself. She looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her face. My father looked at me, then he looked at Wesley, then he looked back at me. I didn't know you were bringing someone, he said. I didn't know I needed your permission, I said. The lawyer cleared his throat. The meeting began. My mother's estate, it turned out, was more complicated than I had known. She had inherited a property from her own parents, a cottage on Georgian Bay, a piece of land that had been in her family for 3 generations. It was not part of my father's firm. It had nothing to do with Whitmore Financial. It was hers, separate, held in her name alone. She had left it to me. My father had known about the will. The lawyer confirmed this, in the careful language of lawyers, which is designed to convey information while absorbing no liability. My mother had updated the will 4 months before her diagnosis. The cottage was mine. My father set down his pen. That property, he said, is part of a family legacy that requires active stewardship. Your mother, in her final years, was not always in a position to make fully informed decisions. I looked at him. Are you contesting the will? I asked. I'm saying, he said, very carefully, that I would like us to discuss this as a family. The family friend nodded as if she had rehearsed this. I looked at the lawyer. Is there anything about my mother's competency at the time the will was signed that is legally actionable? The lawyer looked at my father, then back at me. The will was signed prior to any formal diagnosis. It has been reviewed. It is valid. My father leaned back in his chair. He looked at me the way he always had when I'd done something that inconvenienced him. Not angry, exactly, but cold in a way that was meant to communicate that my choices had consequences, and that he would be the one deciding what those consequences were. Phoebe, he said, you walked away from this family. You made that choice. I think it would be appropriate for you to consider what it means to simply take from it now. I had known he would say something like this. I had told Wesley the night before, lying awake in the hotel room, that my father would find a way to make my mother's death about my failures. Wesley had said quietly, let him. Just be ready. I was ready. I didn't walk away, I said. I was removed. There's a difference. And I'd like it noted, for whatever record exists of this conversation, that my mother chose to leave me that property. She knew what she was doing when she signed that will. She knew exactly what it meant. And I think, whatever else we want to say about her, we owe her the respect of not pretending otherwise. The room was quiet. My father's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. I had spent 19 years learning to read it. You've always been dramatic, he said. Just like. I'd like to see the full documentation, I said to the lawyer. Not to my father. The will, the property title, and anything related to the estate's handling since my mother's diagnosis. I'll have my own lawyer review it. My father laughed. It was the laugh I remembered. Short, dismissive, designed to make you feel like a child who had suggested something absurd. Your lawyer, he said. Yes, I said, my lawyer. Wesley shifted slightly in his chair beside me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That's your right, the lawyer said, and slid a folder across the table. What came next took 3 months. I won't walk you through all of it, because some of it is still in process and some of it is not mine alone to share. But here is what my lawyer found when she reviewed the estate documentation. My father had been drawing management fees from my mother's separate property account for 7 years. The cottage had required some maintenance, a new roof in 2019, some dock repairs, seasonal upkeep. My father had positioned himself as the manager of that account, and he had been billing his own firm for estate management services at a rate that was, generously described, aggressive. Over 7 years, the fees totaled just over $94,000. My mother's property. My mother's inheritance from her parents, billed by my father's firm to my mother's account, for services she may not have fully understood she was paying for, in the years when her clarity was already beginning to slip. My lawyer used the word fiduciary a lot. She also used the phrase potential elder financial abuse, which I had to step away from my kitchen table after reading because I needed a few minutes before I could come back and continue. I gave my father the opportunity to make it right without escalating. My lawyer sent a letter. It was professional. It gave him 30 days to provide full accounting and propose remediation. He responded to his own lawyer, who characterized the fees as standard industry practice and suggested my claim was emotionally motivated. Emotionally motivated, as if grief and accuracy were somehow in conflict. We filed a complaint with the Ontario Securities Commission and the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. We also filed a civil claim. I want to be honest about something. I did not know we would win. I didn't know what winning even looked like. I had a valid will, a legitimate grievance, and a lawyer who believed me, and that had felt, for most of my adult life, like more than I was entitled to expect. But the documentation was clear. The fees were not defensible, and my father, it turned out, had not been careful enough to cover them completely. The settlement came on a Thursday. It was not a dramatic moment. It was an email from my lawyer, which I read sitting in my studio in Halifax with paint on my hands, and which informed me that the fees would be returned in full, plus interest, that the cottage title would be transferred to me unencumbered, and that my father's firm had agreed to an independent audit of its estate management practices as a condition of avoiding further regulatory action. I sat with that for a long time. I called Wesley, He was at work and he stepped outside to take the call, and when I told him, he said, "Good. Are you okay?" I said I thought so. He said, "I'll pick up dinner. You don't have to cook." That was it. That was the whole celebration. Takeout from the Thai place we liked, on the couch with the dog between us, watching something forgettable on television. I cried a little after dinner. Not from sadness exactly. Something more complicated. The particular weight of a thing you've carried so long that when it finally lifts, you don't feel lighter right away. You just feel the absence of it, which is its own kind of adjustment. My brother called me that weekend. He had known something was happening. He'd been copied on some of the early correspondence, and he'd spoken to my father, and he had done the careful, neutral thing he always did, which was to stay out of it. But he called that weekend, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think she knew." "Knew what?" I asked. "Mom, I think she knew when she updated the will what she was doing. I think it was the clearest thing she did in those last years." I didn't say anything. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder," he said. "When you left, I was 14, I didn't know how." "You were 14, I said. It wasn't yours to fight." We talked for a long time after that. We are still talking. It is slow and imperfect, and we sometimes go 3 weeks without connecting, but it is real, and I think my mother would have wanted that. I think it was maybe the other thing she was trying to make possible when she signed that will. A door she was leaving open for us to find each other again. The cottage is on Georgian Bay. I went there for the first time in early September, just as the season was turning. I drove up from Toronto, where Wesley and I had gone to finalize some paperwork, and I turned off the highway and followed the road through the trees, and I parked in the gravel lot that my grandparents had paved sometime in the 1980s, and I just sat there for a while. The lake was the color of pewter in the morning light. A loon called from somewhere across the water. The dock needed work. New boards, maybe a section replaced entirely. The main door stuck when I tried to open it, which I remembered from childhood, the same swollen resistance it had always had in the summer humidity. Inside, it smelled like thyme, like wood smoke and old books and something floral that I couldn't identify but that I associated immediately and without thinking with my grandmother. I walked through every room. I stood at the window that faced the water for a long time. My mother had sat in this room. She had grown up here. She had brought her children here. I remembered summers as a little girl, before everything became about my father's ambitions and my father's schedule and what the family needed to look like for the firm's clients. I remembered catching frogs at the edge of the water with my brother. I remembered my grandmother teaching me to make butter tarts in the kitchen, which is too hot in August and always has been. I set my bag down on the bed in the room that had been mine when I was small, and I thought about my mother. Not the version of her that had handed my father that letter. Not the version that had called and asked me to come home and then retreated into not wanting to be in the middle. The version that had sat in a lawyer's office sometime before everything got harder and had decided, with full clarity, that this place belonged to me, that she wanted me to have it, that whatever had happened, whatever had been said or unsaid or done or undone, she still knew where I was. She had found a way to say it. I stayed for 4 days. I fixed the door. I walked every morning along the path that runs behind the property through the trees, the one my grandfather built himself over several summers with crushed gravel and wooden edging. I started a new series of paintings in my sketchbook, just preliminary work, light studies, the way the water moves in the afternoon when the wind comes from the west. Wesley drove up on the 3rd day. He stood at the end of the dock and looked out at the bay and said, "We could fix this up properly." I said yes, I think we could. I've been asked since I started sharing parts of this story, whether I have forgiven my father. It's the question everyone wants answered. I understand why. Forgiveness is the part of the story that makes it feel finished, that transforms it from a wound into a lesson, that lets the audience go home with something resolved. I don't have a clean answer. I am not angry in the way I was at 19, standing on that sidewalk in November with my coat in a bag. That anger was survival. I don't need it anymore in the same way. But I also haven't spoken to my father since the settlement, and I don't know if I will. He is a man who built his identity on control, and I am someone who spent a decade learning to live without his approval, and I'm not sure what a relationship between those two people looks like, or whether it needs to exist. What I know is this: my mother left me something real, not just the property, though the property is real, and I am grateful for it in a way that still surprises me. She left me the knowledge that she saw me, that somewhere in the years when we weren't talking, and I had told myself it didn't matter, she had been thinking about me, making a decision about me. That is not nothing, that is in fact quite a lot. I am 31 years old. I make my living doing the thing my father told me was a hobby. I live in Halifax with a structural engineer who picks up dinner when I need him to, and doesn't ask me to be anything other than what I am. I have a cottage on Georgian Bay that smells like my grandmother and needs a new section of dock, and has a kitchen that is too hot in August. I have a brother who is learning, slowly, how to be in a room with me without having to manage the distance between me and our father. That's not nothing either. Some doors close. Some of them, it turns out, were being held open by someone you didn't know was still holding on. I walked through the glass doors of that boardroom in March not knowing what I was walking toward. I just knew I was done walking away. That turned out to be enough. I keep thinking about the cottage door. The way it stuck when I first tried to open it, that same swollen resistance it had always had, and how I just kept pushing until it gave. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just steady pressure, and then it opened. That's the most honest way I know to describe what the last 12 years actually felt like. People hear a story like mine, and they want there to be a single moment of courage. A day I decided to stop being afraid. But it wasn't like that. It was 1,000 small decisions made when I was exhausted and broke, and not at all sure I was doing the right thing. Choosing Halifax over his approval. Choosing the waitressing shift over calling home and apologizing for something I hadn't done wrong. Choosing to stay in the studio another hour when the paintings weren't working, and it would have been so easy to decide this was all a mistake. What I've come to understand is that integrity isn't a feeling. It's not the warm certainty that you're on the right side of something. Most of the time it feels like stubbornness or stupidity or both. It's doing the thing that aligns with what you actually believe even when no one is watching and no one is going to reward you for it. My father built a career on the appearance of integrity. The framed clippings, the etched glass, the right handshake at the right charity dinner. What he didn't understand is that you can't construct it from the outside in. It has to come from something you decided about yourself before anyone else had an opinion. My mother understood that. She sat in a lawyer's office and made a clear-eyed decision about what was right, and she did it quietly without anyone's applause, at a time when her world was already narrowing. That took more courage than anything I did. She didn't have Wesley beside her. She didn't have a lawyer who believed her. She just had her own sense of what was true. The financial piece, the $94,000, the audit, the settlement, people focus on that because it's concrete. I understand why. But what mattered more to me was learning to think clearly under pressure. My lawyer kept saying, document everything, don't react, let the facts carry the argument. That discipline, the ability to set aside the part of you that wants to scream and instead ask the right question at the right moment, that was something I had to build deliberately. It didn't come naturally. It came from years of having to figure things out without a safety net, from learning that panic is expensive and clarity is the only tool that actually works. And then there's the part I don't talk about as much, which is just the endurance of it. The staying, the not giving up on Halifax when it was hard, not giving up on the work when it wasn't selling, not giving up on the idea that my life was mine to build even when the person who was supposed to believe that most had told me otherwise. That kind of persistence isn't heroic. It's unglamorous and repetitive, and sometimes it looks indistinguishable from just being too tired to quit, but it compounds. 12 years of it compounds into something you can actually stand on. The cottage needs a new section of dock. The kitchen is too hot in August. The door still sticks a little, even after I fixed it. I wouldn't change any of it.